YouTube too. So good afternoon, everybody. This is the Grouchy Historian, and I'm here as promised to discuss the 1619 project. This is something that I've been working on for a while and something that everybody's interested in. So we're going to dive right in. Okay. So what is the 1619 project? I know some of you have probably heard a lot about it. Don't know if anybody's had time to read it. I recently got the book from our local library so that I would get to the source material myself. So what is the 1619 project, right? Here it is. And this is a direct quote. Okay. The New York Times Magazine's award-winning 1619 project reframed our understanding of American history by placing slavery and its continuing legacy at the center of our national narrative. So let's be very clear. And the 1619 project is not about enriching American history or looking at neglected viewpoints of American history or, anything like that. It is literally to rewrite American history to place slavery and its continuing legacy at the center of everything, right? Whereas I would say what they're trying to tell you is that everything you've learned about America has been essentially whitewashed to ignore slavery and racism. Therefore, history must be rewritten to reshape this narrative. So who are its creators? Well, its creators are clearly the New York Times, led by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is an American investigative journalist known for her coverage. This is right off her Wikipedia page, by the way. Known for her coverage of civil rights in the United States. She joined the New York Times as a staff writer in April 2015 and won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2020 for her work on the 1619 project. She is not a historian, not an academic historian. She does have a history undergraduate degree, but she is a investigative journalist and staff feature writer. Keep that in mind as we go along, okay? But I told you all that I would give you a honest appraisal, at least from my point of view and my time of almost 40 years of studying history. I will say without a doubt that this is an extremely well done effort, right? Let's just call it what it is. The progressive left doesn't mess around. They are well financed, they are extremely focused, and they have a mission. The easiest thing that I would quickly describe the 1619 project is it is viewpoint history. But like all history, it does get a few things right, just in a roundabout way. Right, slavery as a topic does need more discussion. I can certifiably tell you that yes, as a someone who went through grade school, high school, and even as an undergraduate, slavery was not an intense focus of discussion. It was, one of those mini topics that you sort of briefly covered in those high school history courses that you would take. So, okay, nobody's arguing that perhaps slavery as a topic needs to get more discussion. And of course, no one who honestly looks at American history would say that America is perfect. And of course, the road to civil rights and a, quote, colorblind society has been challenging. Okay, this is, nobody disputes this. It all, like everything else that deals with history, there's context, there are nuances. History is not, to use a phrase, black and white. History literally is 50 shades of grays, to use a term. And there are a lot of nuances that the 1619 project simply glosses over, as well as a lot of really bad history. So what does it get wrong? Okay, so there's really about 4 topics that I would say here, and I'm going to quote some of these. So number 1, it says that slavery was and this is my definite interpretation here because sometimes they're very subtle. Says slavery was a uniquely evil American institution. At one point in the book, it says the Southern slavery in the antebellum period before the Civil War was one of the 5 great slave empires in human history. So let's go through this. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the South, Brazil, which, by the way, slavery continued in Brazil until 1870, and Oh, and the Caribbean. Little tidbit that they don't really talk about. Slavery was actually, I think, more prevalent in the Caribbean in this colonial era, where they had large sugar plantations than it was in the U.S. As many slaves were directed toward these Caribbean islands as they were to the U.S. They sort of gloss over that fact. They also gloss over slavery in a genuine historical context, right? I mean, let's be honest. Slavery has been around for nearly all of human history, right? It was written about by the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. It's in the Bible. And it was sort of a fact of life, particularly in the area of warfare. If you went to war with your neighboring city, war was quite literally a matter of life or death, because if you lost, typically your city would be razed, all of the men would be killed, and the women and children would be enslaved. And that went on for centuries. Okay, the other thing that they sort of gloss over in the book is that the slaves that were brought over from Africa were, of course, sold by other Africans. And they, again, that gets very little coverage. That not only did, being perfectly honest, a lot of Englishmen and later Americans got rich off the slave trade, so did a number of African kingdoms and leaders and rulers as well. That is not discussed much here at all. But let's get to the three big things. The first one, and probably the most controversial one and generated the most rebuttal, was the fact that they stated that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. Now, this was based on a proclamation that was made in 1775 by Governor Dinsmore, who was the royal governor of Virginia. That was basically a British version of the Emancipation Proclamation, which basically said any slave that wished to escape or throw off the chains of slavery was welcome to join the British. Now, of course, the white colonial Southerners took this to basically interpreted this that the British were trying to incite slave rebellion, and they didn't deal well with this, obviously. And it was a factor, to be fair, it was a factor in their grievances against the British, but it was not the primary reason that the colonists revolted against England. I'm going to go over some resources here, but I do want to read a couple of things. Again, the announced goal of the 1619 project is to reframe history, right? The second thing is there was a letter. There were two major corrections posted to the 1619 project. One of them was an article in Politico from a sympathetic historian who said she had been consulted by the New York Times and the 1619 project editors to comment on the history, and said that they had gotten it wrong about the revolution. Now, she was very sympathetic. She thought the 1619 project was a great thing, and she didn't want them to get this particular fact wrong, because any reputable Revolutionary War historian would immediately point out that this was not only a glaring error, it was an intentional glaring error. She was ignored. When a group of distinguished historians said, we have a problem with this, they were basically ignored and questioned away as well. They're just a bunch of traditional historians who like the traditional narrative history and don't like that the 1619 project is going to try to say something else about it. These are authors that I personally have read, are Pulitzer Prize winning authors for history back when the Pulitzer Prize meant something. And again, they were not unsympathetic to the causes and what the 1619 project was trying to do. They were simply telling them to try to get the history right. The second one is a takedown of Abraham Lincoln as the great emancipator. There's a couple of areas that they attack Lincoln. One, that he was not immediately against slavery when the Civil War started. And two, that his vision was to free the slaves and send them back to Africa. Well, okay, so for the second one, yes, there was a very large group of abolitionists in that era that thought the only way to satisfy everyone was to free the slaves and then return them home. Well, of course, many of them had been born in America and were basically Americans and had no knowledge of their former, their ancestors in Africa. So this was problematic from the start. But the other one is, again, there is a nuance here about Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, his number one job was to preserve the Union. And he was very conscious of the Constitution, which they also have a lot of issues with. I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. The entire platform that Lincoln ran on in 1860 in the presidential election was that he had no constitutional authority to change, undo, end, free the slaves where they already existed. His point, and the entire point of the new Republican Party, was they did not want slavery extending into the territories, because their intention was, by keeping slavery basically where it was, again, I think their eventual plan was that slavery would no longer be economically viable, and that at some point that the United States would work toward gradual emancipation. There had been a track record of this in the early 19th century, the early 1800s. Most of the new American northern states, because of course slavery was legal in all of the United States when the Constitution was ratified and when the government was formed. But even from the very beginning, there was a large segment of the population that wanted to end slavery. I just finished a fantastic book on George Washington and the first Congress. When the very first Congress was seated, a group of Quakers came up from Pennsylvania and immediately started lobbying Congress to do away with slavery. Now, obviously, this did not sit well with the slaveholding South, but nonetheless, there was a movement almost from the beginning of America that slavery was inherently evil and contradictory to the statements made in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, against the very foundational principles of our country. And in most of the northern colonies, they had passed laws that gradually emancipated slavery and gradually emancipated the slaves and ended slavery by the early 18th century. So there was all reason to hope or assume that at some point, just as it did in Brazil in 1870, that some sort of gradual emancipation would end slavery without the force of arms. Well, this was, of course, not the case when the states of the Deep South seceded after the election of 1860. But nonetheless, Lincoln was also a master politician, and he did not want to get, as the saying goes, get ahead of his skis. He maneuvered the idea of freeing the slaves through the Congress as the war developed and as the North gained military advantage. And he was responsible for ultimately the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. That the 13th Amendment freed the slaves, the 14th Amendment made them citizens, and the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Now, ultimately then, the rest of the essays in this book are variations on a theme, right? That essentially my gross interpretation, and I'm welcome if anybody has any alternate opinions, that slavery and its legacy are the root of all problems in the African American community. Now, if you want to get down to it, page 472, here it is, folks. Here's the bottom line up front. The 1619 Project is ultimately about reparations. And the author makes no bones about it. She says that reparations need to happen. Now, here's what she says, because I actually bookmarked this page. Page 472, she's talking about justice, racial justice, says at the center of these policies must be reparations. The process, quote, quote, at the center of these policies must be reparations. The process of creating the racial wealth chasm begins with the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with the 40 acres they were promised. This was the old adage after the Civil War that all the freed slaves would be given 40 acres and a mule to farm their own land. Then she said, reparations are not about punishing white Americans, and white Americans are not the ones who would pay for them. It does matter if your ancestors engaged in slavery it does not matter if your ancestors engaged in slavery or you just immigrated here 2 weeks ago. Reparations amount to a societal obligation in a nation where our Constitution sanctioned slavery, Congress passed laws protecting it, and our federal government initiated, condoned, and practiced legal racial segregation and discriminations until Black Americans until a half century ago. And so it is the federal government that would pay. Now, of course, this is the problem with most New York Times reporters because they're like, the federal government will pay. Well, who the heck is the federal government? It's you and me, folks. It's called taxpayer dollars. And if you don't think this is a real issue, look what's going on in California today. California tried to pass a reparations bill. They had this big commission, hoopla, hearings, public, blah, 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 blah. Figured it would cost $80 billion. And even Governor Hairgel, otherwise known as Gavin Newsom, said, yeah, no, that's not going to happen. Because I like being a politician, I like getting elected, and that's just not going to happen. Okay. This is what it's all about, folks. It's about reparations. Let's just break it down to what it is. It's about reparations. So, as I said, the other thing about this is if you look at the writers in here, because again, this their biographies, sorry, we'll talk about the bibliography in a second. Few of the writers are historians. I think 4 of the writers of the essays in here are historians, and none of them specialize in American history. Most of them specialize in African-American history. Unsurprising. From a historical point of view, and this is where I get into the good stuff, because this is what I do with all the books I read. There are no primary sources cited, right? This is like the holy grail of any narrative history, is you want to go to primary sources, you want to go through archives, you want to get, you want to do deep archival research. There's almost none of that here. I couldn't find any myself. Most of the works they cited are sympathetic secondary sources, which books like this, Debunking the 1619 Project, points out that a lot of these secondary sources that are used by more than one author are problematic in their own right. Okay. Again, but here's the fun part. The 1619 Project is its own cottage industry. Now, keep in mind, of course, that our good friend Hannah Nicole Jones is talking about how white people basically owe black people. But here's the deal. She's making a lot of money off of this. Now, I don't know what this has to do with anything, but I found this very interesting. So she is a speaker, and of course she makes excellent speaker's fees, somewhere between $10,000 and $25,000 a speech. Plus, I'm pretty sure, because I know how capitalism works, she's probably making book money. And I'm sure she probably gets something from the whole cottage industry that's popped up around this. The Pulitzer Institute has a whole 1619 curriculum. We're going to talk about that in a second, too. There's a whole industry about this. And make no mistake, this is going to get into the public school system. It's already there. It's going to no doubt filter into AP history and everything else. So, what do you do? What do you do as parents? How do you react to this? Well, the first thing you have to do is educate yourself. As I said before, I'm actually recording this on Zoom as well. This is the first time I've tried the dual recording. We'll see how it looks. I'm going to post this on my YouTube channel, and I'm going to post a link to the slides that I put up on the YouTube channel. And at the end of the slides are some resources that you can use if you want to do your own research, which I always encourage. Okay, you need to be prepared for this. Okay. In response to the 1619 Project, at the end of his term, President Trump set up a President's Advisory Commission that started what was called the 1776 Project. This was headed by Larry Arnn, I believe you pronounce his name, who was the president of Hillsdale College. Well, you can imagine what the progressive left thought about that. There's a lot of really colorful metaphors that I could use, but let's just say that, as my wife would say, let's just say they lost their ish. Totally lost their ish. There's actually a Wikipedia page on this. It is fascinating that they talk about this, that says without any, this was written, the 1776 Project was written without any consultation with professional historians of the United States. While we leave it to historians to offer a direct rebuttal of the document's inaccuracies, if any should choose to do so, we note that it is plagued by procedural deficiencies that would render it unpublishable as a serious work of scholarship. Basically, that it was printed without any peer review. Interesting. Well, I guess to a certain extent, the 1619 Project was peer reviewed a little bit. They just ignored all the comments. But again, you can judge for yourself. I'm going to have a link to this report in the slides as well. Now, which is hilarious. Oh, the other hilarious things is they say that none of the historians are specialized in American history. Really? Neither do the ones on the 1619 Project. However, I can definitely say that at least one of those historian, Victor Davis Hanson, is a sensational military historian. He's actually a classicist. He specializes in Greek Roman history. He's also a military historian. But this is kind of a spurious argument because everything they said about the 1776 project is essentially true about the 1619 project as well. So, again, what do you do? Look at when school starts this year, look at your kids' textbooks. I guess they're all electronic these days. It's like, wow, that's got to be weird. But take a look at your kids' textbooks. See what they say about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. My acid test, okay, that I always do is I look at two things. Number one, if the book goes that far, I look at how they treat Ronald Reagan. Yeah, most of them fail miserably in their treatment of Reagan, one of our greatest presidents, certainly the greatest president we've had in the last 50 years. And also look at how they treat the founders. If all they talk about is the founders as slaveholders, then you can bet that the 1619 Project has influenced that. Now, keep in mind, this really is a subset of the whole critical race thing, right? We see a lot in the news about critical race theory, et cetera, et cetera. Forget all that. This is what's going to happen to American history, the 1619 Project, without a doubt, because it has the backing of the New York Times, the Pulitzer Organization, and it is essentially unquestionable, because if you question it, then you either have white fragility, or you just don't want to ignore slavery, or you just want to whitewash history, none of which is true. Now, speaking as a historian, yes, there is a lot of aspects. Again, for those of you that listened to my stories a couple of days ago, there are a lot of aspects. Let's just start with the American Revolution that need exploring. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The traditional history of the Revolution, and there are some great narrative histories of the American Revolution, they are what used to be called drum and musket history. They're military history. Okay, great. There was a war. It was a war for 8 years. It was our longest war before Vietnam, before Afghanistan. But it was also, you could study the revolutionary period from all kinds. It was an insurgency. It was a civil war. It was a huge change to society. It influenced and was influenced by women, of white women, women of color, freed women, slave women. It was influenced by slaves and free blacks. It was influenced by the native tribes. I don't even know what the current politically correct term is. First tribes, Native Americans, American Indians, whatever the term is. All of them had a definite influence on the American Revolution. I will also say that, yes, having lived through and studied that era, there was sort of this deification of the founders that, yes, was a standard historiography for a number of years. I think we can pretty much say that that's gone. But that's not a bad thing, right? I mean, these were people. They were sinners. Let's just call it what it was, right? Anybody who saw the musical Hamilton loved the ladies, and the ladies loved Alexander. And sometimes those ladies were not his wife. Okay? They were not perfect men. But they had a vision, and they understood that there were contradictions to that vision, but they were also politicians, and they knew that in order to get anything done, there had to be compromises. This, of course, is the anathema to the writers and purveyors of the 1619 Project. There had to be compromises. And let's be honest, those compromises involved the status of slavery. That doesn't mean that they didn't realize that slavery was evil, and they sure knew that slavery was a festering problem that, if it wasn't resolved, was going to have downstream bad implications for the country, as indeed it did 77 years later. So there's been some really excellent new history to cover these topics. I have two of them on my shelf. For those of you that follow me, Tuesday, we went to the Martha Washington lecture at Mount Vernon, picked up the book on women in the Revolutionary War. My wife God bless her, actually pointed me to the new book by David Hackett Fisher, who is an outstanding revolutionary historian, wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning Washington's Crossing about slavery. Here's the interesting thing about his book that I'm looking forward to. Nowadays, of course, because of the internet and computing power, we have a lot more data, like raw data, primary source data about slavery. There's a lot of databases. I go to the back, I start looking through the sources. And this is what Mr. Fisher has used as the basis of his book. And what he's going to do is look at how slavery was not this monolithic thing, but that slavery was very different in the different regions of the country in the colonial era. And I think it's going to be very illuminating, particularly to somebody like me. And I'm fine with that. I have another book by Woody Holton, another excellent Civil War historian. Actually, I have two books by Woody Holton. One of them is a recasting, as it were, of the Revolutionary War, looking at it from the viewpoint of those forgotten people, women, Indians, slaves. Okay, cool. I think that's going to be a very fascinating book too. But it's not viewpoint history. And that's kind of what the 16, I mean, this, again, they make no bones about what the purpose of them writing that history is. It is reparations. And that's what I have a problem with. It's not history, it's advocacy. So let's just call it what it is. It's advocacy, and we'll move on. So hopefully you found this interesting. I don't know if anybody has any questions, but I'm happy to answer them. Like I said, this is on Instagram Live. It's on YouTube, probably either or both. Who knows? Maybe I'll get kicked off after I post this, but I don't really care. I think this is important. We need to talk about these things. There's absolutely no doubt. But we need to talk about them within context, and we need to talk about them not as grievance history. We need to talk about them as American history, because it is part of the story of America. Okay, then let's talk about it. But here's the final thing I'm going to say before I sign off. It all comes down to one thing. How do you want your children to learn about America? What do you want to teach your children about America? That America is this horrible place that's filled with structural racism, where people of color can't get ahead? Or is America a fundamentally good place, not perfect, but good, where you can go as far as your talents and ability and willingness to work and sacrifice take you? I mean, here's what it all comes down to. Life isn't fair. There's no such thing as equity. There might be equality, but it's equality of possibilities, not equality of outcomes. There's no such thing as equity. There's no such thing as being fair. If life was fair, I would have hair, and I could do a jump shot like Michael Jordan, and I'd have Elon Musk's money. But guess what? I don't. There are a lot of people that start out in hard situations. Okay, I know some. I'm sure you do too. Had crappy home lives, went to not that great a school, but they made something of themselves. It was hard, no doubt about it. It was hard. I know a lot of them joined the military. When I was in the military, that's what a lot of people said. I joined the military because, hell, I need to get out of my hometown. There was nothing there. Hell, I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, right? I have no, a lot of them are like, well, I don't really want to know what I want to study in college, but I figured I'd at least get a job. Okay, cool, smart, right? So that's what it's all about. It's grievance history. It's like you owe me something. No, I don't. You're owed equal justice under the law, and we can discuss that. We are owed equal opportunity, and we can discuss that. You are not owed equal outcomes. That just doesn't work that way. Like I said, there's only one Michael Jordan. Hey, there's only one Oprah too, right? So I'm going to post this on YouTube. I'm going to post this here. I will get my slides turned into a PDF, and I will post the link in my Instagram links if you want to download the slides. I have linked up the books that I used to rebut the 1619 project, if you are interested in them. And then I've also linked the 1776 report, which I also, it's about 14 pages. You might want to download and read that. That's what I would recommend. And again, if you were looking for curriculum ideas, I know it's summer. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, school's finally out. Woo! But I know some of you also start thinking about the next school year. happy to do that. I think we have to be honest with our kids about slavery and the legacy of slavery. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot of ways to do that are not grievance history. Okay. Thank you all. I appreciate the watch. Hopefully you have found it useful, and we'll see you next time.